So we have a little short video for today. Midterm in 2 weeks from today, end of week 2. The information on the midterm, I'll give you more about that as we approach. I'll talk about the Scantron cards, how to fill them out, and what you should be studying. You should be studying this and everything we've done already, and you'll be studying hopefully another couple banks of slides before we get there. The material that we're covering over the next 2 weeks is all related to the nervous system. And so today we're introducing the nervous system only. But we're going in depth on structures, the brain, the spinal cord, what nerves are, and function. What is a membrane potential? How do those result in action potentials? How are signals sent that allow us to contract a muscle or digest food or breathe? All of those things are mediated by the nervous system. And really, this is probably one of the more complex topics to study in anatomy and physiology. So we're starting you off at a high level. If you can get this done, you can get anything done. But it's important, I think, to start here because everything else we talk about is subject to nervous influence. What I mean by that is it's controlled by the nervous system. The nervous system are the puppet strings to which the entire body is attached. Every muscle, every tendon, joint, organ, every sensation that you feel is all due to the actions of the nervous system. So I want to introduce the nervous system. We'll talk about the branches. That means the compartmentalization, how you might divide and understand the nervous system. We're going to be able, by the end of this section, to talk about the types of cells that are found in nervous tissue briefly. But the main focus on what a nerve is or what a neuron is comes in the next set of slides when we talk about action potentials. But we're looking at what nerves are and how they're grouped into different structures. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the brain. It's central to the nervous system. Every thought you have, memory you make, every sensation that you realize is because of the actions of the brain, and it is complex. We still don't fully understand the brain, but we're going to do our best to decipher what we do know. We'll parse out the individual structures and then talk about their associated functions. So this section deals with the brain. The next section deals with structure and function of the peripheral nerves, so the spinal cord, nerves going to your muscles, the digestive system, things like that. And then the third batch of slides will deal with how the signals are being sent, what are the mechanics and the physiology of sending a signal through a nerve. And really that underlies the function of the nervous system completely, the ability to send signals. The nervous system is just a series of conduits. And they go to different places, they react to different things, they interface with many and various different nerves, and the combinations and amounts of those nerves interacting and firing is what allows you to make a memory, to remember something, to dream, to walk around, to think, to breathe, to smell, to taste, to eat. Those are all due to the actions of these conduits. And the conduits function on the premise of being excitable. You can turn them on or you can turn them off. Some of them can be turned on a lot. Some of them can be turned on a little bit. But largely this idea of excitability is fairly binary. It's on or it's not. Sometimes it's really on or it's not. But the excitability is the inherent characteristic of nerves, which is amazing. That drives everything else. Me saying these words to you right now, you remembering last class or the quiz we just did, that's just nerves firing in a different pattern. Your experience is underpinned by the excitability of these nerve cells. So what I want you to acknowledge now is the premise. We're not going to talk about how a cell is excited for another 2 sets of slides. Just remember that they are excitable. Now, pulling back, we want to understand the roadmap of the nervous system. What do I mean when I say nervous system? How can we begin to divide it out to understand their functions? And can you divide it out to divide their functions? There's a couple ways that we try to organize the nervous system to understand it a bit better. And so you'll have a diagram like this in your textbook, very similar. This one simply shows the overall gross separation on a structural basis. This is the structural division of the nervous system. And loosely, we break it into two parts. All of the nerves, neurons, pathways, structures in the nervous system, we break into two parts. The central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, conveniently located centrally within the body. Located within the dorsal cavity, if you remember back to the first set of slides. That was that encased space within the skull and within the vertebral column, the dorsal cavity. The central nervous system is located there and made up of the brain and spinal cord. And that's it. What happens there, the structures, we're going to explore that coming up, but that comprises the central nervous system. The complement to the central nervous system is everything else. Conveniently enough, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS for short, is everything else. So it's not technically correct, but you can loosely think of the division as anything outside of that dorsal cavity is peripheral nervous system. As soon as a nerve leaves the spinal cord and passes between the vertebrae, peripheral nervous system. As soon as a nerve leaves the skull, leaves the cranium and goes to the face, peripheral nervous system. It's everything else. That's a catch-all term. Now, when we talk about the division structurally, this is what I mean. But I'm going to show you why this doesn't hold up. Our understanding goes a bit deeper than this. It's not as simple as saying central versus peripheral. In the book, in the diagram that you have in the book, they make reference to a couple different structures that aren't shown here. And so I wanted to separate those structures out for you briefly. Most of the yellow conduits are nerves. And nerves are made up of neurons. That's the individual base unit, the cell of a nerve. A neuron is the cell of the nervous system. So most of the yellow conduits are neurons, and you might see these little bunches that are mostly evident around the spinal cord called ganglia. And ganglia are simply an aggregation of many different neuronal bodies. So a lot of nerve cells are clustered within a ganglion. Ganglion is one, ganglia is multiple. So those little growths, those projections simply indicate there are a lot of cells there. And we'll see that these are really interesting places because it allows for complicated connection and integration. Because there are a lot of cells there, a signal being sent to a ganglion can go to a lot of different places. So those become important when we talk about integration and processing of reflexes, for instance. So be aware of those structures, but for our purposes right now, we're talking about central versus peripheral nervous system. And all of the nerves and their associated structures in the central nervous system tend to arise in the brain. Some of them arise in the spinal cord, but most of them are projections from the brain down through the spinal cord. All the nerves, all the neurons are in the brain and the spinal cord, and they are mostly tasked with processing. So if you break it into central and peripheral, and you have to assign a job to those structurally different nervous systems, the central nervous system is tasked with processing, interpreting information, comparing it to a plan, creating a plan of action, and then sending those signals out. It's the brain of the operation. It's tasked with processing. This is where all of your memories live, your thoughts live, the information on blood pressure and ventilation and body temperature, that's where it lives. And the start of every response to a disturbance in homeostasis, the start of every bench press comes from here, the central nervous system. The release of sweat onto the body surface starts in the central nervous system. Secretion of stomach acid when you're hungry starts in the central nervous system. It sets the plan and initiates things into motion. If the central nervous system is tasked with processing, it executes those tasks through the peripheral nervous system. This is the working subunit of the nervous system. These are where the action signals get sent. These are also where sensory information is relayed. These are the highways where cars get to and from where they need to go. All the tissue outside the central nervous system is considered peripheral. They are the thoroughfares of information. They convey sensory information back to the brain. They convey efferent or actions, motor signals from the brain to the muscles or to any other organ that needs it. So the central nervous system is tasked with processing. The peripheral nervous system does the job laid out by the central nervous system. And so you can appreciate for the simplicity of the structural division, the sheer magnitude of different responses is quite impressive. You can have voluntary locomotion by activating skeletal muscle. So I can fidget around up here and walk around because of some plan created by my central nervous system that's being carried out by the peripheral nerves that go towards my legs and hands and mouth. I have voluntary control over some aspects. I have involuntary actions that are occurring all the time. Some of these actions are the involuntary control of those homeostatic processes that we want to keep within normal range. Right now, if I get too hot, I'll start to sweat. If I get to sweat and I get uncomfortable, I'll maybe take my jacket off. If I'm getting dizzy, I might sit down. If I need to take a breath, I'll breathe. These are all unconscious. They're automatic responses. I'm separating out one subset of these automatic responses because there's some debate recently as to whether or not it should just be considered as involuntary or if there's another branch to the nervous system. And we'll come back to this on the next slide. But part of the involuntary responses are those related to digestion. And you might think that they should just be included with the involuntary peripheral responses, and maybe you're right. But there's a really unique situation in the gut where the involuntary responses in red deal with my body, how my body works to keep my body happy and functioning. The digestive system interfaces with millions of bacteria in your gut. It interfaces with the food that you bring in. And so it has a slightly specialized role. And we've even tried to figure out, and we have a pretty good sense, that the enteric nervous system, you'll see this on the next slide, but that's the name that we've given to this subset of nerves, can actually be interfered with. The bacteria that are in your gut can actually tap into the nerves in this system. They do that if they're not getting the food that they want. Bacteria, just like people, have preferences. There are many different kinds of bacteria. So if you have a lot of fruits and vegetables, you're going to grow bacteria that like fruits and vegetables. And the opposite is true too, unfortunately. If you drink a lot of beer and eat a lot of fried foods, the bacteria in your gut have a preference for those things. So what happens when they don't get them? They can tap into your nervous system, send a signal to your brain, which we interpret as craving. It's really hard to deal with craving. You have to outlive the bacteria in your gut. Hopefully they die off so good new bacteria can replace them. Anyways, that's a little bit of an aside, but there's a fascinating new field in this area related to the gut microbiome, it's called. You'll learn more about that in upper years. I talk at length about how fecal transplants can cure diabetes in clinical exphys. You heard that right. So we have this structural division, central versus peripheral. And if we have to, we can assign roles to the structural division. What I want to do just quickly is introduce a slightly different way to frame it, and then we'll call it for the day. This is a functional division. And this is more appropriate because if you think about it, all of the different functions in the body are processed by the same brain. There isn't a hard and fast structural division. There are different areas of the brain that are specialized for vision or auditory stimuli or temperature, but it's the same brain. And so it might be a bit more appropriate to divide these areas functionally. What parts of the nervous system deal with balance? What parts of the nervous system deal with speech or learning a second language? And if we think about it functionally, you can still see the division of the central nervous system at the top. That's the big daddy processor at the top. And the peripheral nervous system in purple, which is everything else. But now we have a sense of how the signals differ within those systems. Overall, the main functions are always the same: sensation, integration, and response. The peripheral nervous system senses something. It's information we're concerned with. It's relayed in blue on the left-hand side to the central nervous system where it's integrated, it's processed, it's understood, and then a response is created with all of those branches in orange on the right. And that's where we have a lot of functional division in how these tasks are assigned or how they're carried out. There are many different types of tasks that need to be carried out, and as a consequence, we have many different branches of the functional system that we can pull out or tease apart. Just like on the last slide, these can be done voluntarily or involuntarily. And there are specific branches that deal with the voluntary actions and others that deal with the involuntary actions. Even though they're all peripheral, we've divided them functionally into what we call the somatic nervous system. That side of the peripheral nervous system deals with any voluntary motion. So if I'm doing a makeshift bicep curl, it's the actions of my somatic nervous system that allow me to move my arm. I have voluntary control over it. My heart beating, on the other hand, is the result of the autonomic nervous system functioning. I can't control my heartbeat. You can try to take deep breaths and relax, but you aren't making your heartbeat go down. The situation that you create results in your heartbeat going down. Most things in the body are either under one or the other. And the last point I'll make today is that some things are under control by both. You've been sitting there breathing normally the entire class. Until I call attention to it, where now all of a sudden you have conscious control over your breathing muscles. And it's really hard to go back to a normal pattern of breathing because you're controlling it somatically. Those muscles are a special case. You have autonomic or involuntary and somatic voluntary control. So we'll go into, we'll explore this in a bit more detail when we come back on Tuesday next week. Have a wonderful weekend. Don't forget, midterm is in 2 weeks.